Welcome to the New Mexico News Podcast, headlines and stories from the land of enchantment. Brought to you by KRQE. Here's Chris McKee and Gabrielle Burkhart.
So Gabby, I'd say it has been a bit of a redefining summer when it comes to how cities are able to deal with homelessness in the United States, not just in New Mexico, of course. Yes, it's been across the entire U.S. And that redefinition I'm talking about has come in the form of new rules that apply to local and state governments and how the law allows them to deal with homelessness, specifically encampments.
Yeah, you might remember we talked about this a couple of months ago on the podcast. We can link to that for more context in our show notes if you want to go back and listen on your feed. But back in April, we were talking about the U.S. Supreme Court was getting ready to hand down a decision in a case centering around an ordinance in an Oregon city which prohibited camping on public property and parks. Just last month, the nation's highest court finally handed down its ruling in the case, marking a landmark change in how American cities can address homelessness.
So how does that ruling play out in New Mexico, and how will it affect cities here in their interactions with the homeless? This week, we're welcoming back UNM School of Law Professor Joshua Kastenberg to talk more about it. Professor Kastenberg, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
So the change we're talking about here is tied to a court case called Grants Pass versus Johnson. And the case is tied to an ordinance out of Grants Pass, Oregon, which we mentioned, which allowed for criminal penalties like fines, tickets, and arrests for public camping and sleeping, even if there isn't enough shelter available in that area. So lawyers representing homeless residents in that city argued that amounts to cruel and unusual punishment, which is prohibited by the Eighth Amendment. But ultimately, the Supreme Court's majority disagreed. So let's first talk about the ruling broadly. Professor Kastenberg, what exactly did the U.S. Supreme Court rule in this case, and was it surprising to you at all?
It was surprising with the clarity and definition that the decision resulted in. And what I mean by that is, since the early 1960s, the Supreme Court had overturned laws that had resulted in one of two things. One was called status crimes. The classic one is, years ago, Los Angeles prohibited drug addicts. They didn't prohibit the possession of narcotics or cocaine. That was a separate crime. But if you were a known drug addict, you were prohibited from being in various parts of the city. But we know that drug addicts aren't always on drugs. And so the majority of the Supreme Court, in a case called Robinson versus California, overturned Los Angeles's ordinance, and you can't prohibit someone on the basis of status, whether they're an alcoholic, a drug addict, or being homeless. The knowledge of what being homeless was in the 1960s, which was somewhat tied into drug addiction in the Los Angeles ordinance, is different from what it is today. Our knowledge of what causes homelessness, while not perfect, it'll grow constantly, is far greater than it was in the 60s. But the case law that the Supreme Court and the courts of appeal had issued from that time forward lended themselves to overturn laws and rules that created what I'd call situations of impossibility. So, for example, LA, in another case, outlawed sleeping in public, but they didn't have enough bed space for people. So the Ninth Circuit overturned that decision because human beings cannot stay awake 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Maybe one gets into Ripley's Believe It or Not, but the rest of us are going to collapse somewhere. Florida outlawed vagrancy. And in a case called Papa Cristo versus City of Jacksonville, the Supreme Court overturned that ordinance because it was targeted on two counts, one on race, but also on the basis of homelessness. So you've got this long chain of cases throughout the federal courts, and this Supreme Court did what it's done in a few other areas of the law. For example, overturning Roe versus Wade. It turned 40 years of case law on its head, and it did it in one fell swoop as it applied to homelessness. So that's what surprises me about the decision.
Yeah, it's certainly been a redefining era for a lot of decisions in that realm. When we think about Roe versus Wade being another one, a lot of case law that got turned on its head with that decision. It seems like a part of the big deal over this is that it is the first time, or maybe one of the first times, that we've really got a definitive answer from the Supreme Court on how cities can treat the homeless. But what is your take? Why is this a big deal? What is this case about?
Well, I think, and the justices, who are all very bright, may disagree with what I'm about to say, but this case, this decision throws the issue back into the political arena and not in the legal arena. And what I mean by that is Justice Kavanaugh gave a very poignant question to the city of Grants Pass during oral arguments, which made me initially think he might vote to overturn the ordinance. He didn't. But the poignant question was this: you're going to find individuals who will never be able to pay you. The overwhelming majority of them are not going to be able to pay you. And that means that their credit rating, to the extent they have one, is going to haunt them for the rest of their life. It's a downward spiral. So if you're going to have a law, as Justice Alito has often said in the firearms restrictions cases, at least show us that it's going to have a likelihood of working. So the Grants Pass decision, the likelihood of Grants Pass or any other small city, and I stress that point, small city, in assessing, a way ahead to alleviate homelessness is going to be a political decision. How do they raise tax revenues? Where do they spend money on homeless shelters versus schools versus roads versus, first responders and the like? That's a problem big cities and states are going to face as well. But I also think that it will enable citizens of Grants Pass. And I think this is the other part that homeless advocates often overlook. I mean, both sides tend to overlook each other's positions, but I think the homeless advocates overlook what I'm about to mention now, is that there are people who are just struggling to get by. They work, often they rent rooms out, they can barely afford their homes, and that's typically where homeless encampments occur. And they, too, are deserving of safe streets. They're deserving of places where their kids can stand at bus stops without worries, without needles on the ground and the like. And what the City of Grants Pass decision will have as a secondary effect is the ability of communities that don't have the power of wealthier communities to be able to go to the police and say, we need this encampment removed. And so it may alleviate the difficulties in life and the suffering of people who are most likely at risk, who are not yet homeless.
Along those lines, what kind of power does this give cities like New Mexico to do? And how would you expect this ruling to be utilized potentially in our state?
So that's a great question. My students asked me that yesterday for their first day of school. So there are 50 states and there are 50 state constitutions, and every state constitution is different, but with one similarity. They confer greater rights, or they acknowledge greater rights of the citizens and residents of the state than does our own Bill of Rights in the U.S. Constitution. So there isn't necessarily a uniform answer across all 50 states, but in New Mexico, it's going to be... I think what's going to happen is municipalities and cities like Albuquerque or Santa Fe or Las Cruces will come up with their own ordinances. And as long as those ordinances do not violate or exceed the penalties that New Mexico law caps them at, and as long as they don't create status crimes type individuals, they'll be upheld in the New Mexico Supreme Court. So I think, how does it impact Albuquerque? I think it gives the Albuquerque city authorities, the council, the mayor's office, the police, the county sheriff's office, a greater degree of authority to remove homeless encampments, to close off parks, particularly parks where children frequent, to homeless communities. But the one thing the decision is not going to do at the Supreme Court is end homelessness. And, homeless shelters cost money. Perhaps there'll be an outpouring at some point of public support, churches, civic organizations, synagogues, mosques, and the like. But at the end of the day, it's going to be tax dollars. And then that goes back to the legislature in Santa Fe to solve.
We'll be right back with more of the New Mexico News Podcast.
Kirky Cares Shoes for Kids is KRQE's biggest initiative of the year. And get this, we don't just go and give a couple of shoes here and there. We go into 10 Title I schools each year, and every single student in that school will get a brand new pair of shoes. We've given out more than 30,000 pairs of new shoes, and it's easy to donate. Go to kirkycares.com and hit the donate button.
I've seen some reactions to this ruling, and I think we'll get a little bit more into those in a couple upcoming questions, specifically to how cities are reacting to them here in New Mexico. But I do want to talk about the sort of reactions that vary when it comes to state. Another Western Democratic-controlled state, that being California. Some of the headlines coming from that state include, quote, California cities rethink homelessness tactics after Supreme Court ruling. That was a headline from Bloomberg. Here's another one from USA Today. They wrote, quote, California's cracking down hard on unhoused people and they're running out of options, end quote. In early August, California's Governor Gavin Newsom, a Democrat, he joined state crews who cleaned out under a freeway underpass in Los Angeles, while also sort of pushing local governments to make moves to clean homeless camps, or really, I think what he was talking about during that kind of press event was face the threat of redirecting funds if you don't follow through and clean up the camps like we're doing here with state crews under this underpass.
And California, of course, is a far bigger, more populous state, but it's an indication of a larger, more immediate use of those permissions from the Supreme Court's decision. But meanwhile, some would argue parallels with homelessness issues from California to New Mexico. Both states, as we mentioned, are under Democratic leadership. Why do you think there is more movement happening there compared to here in New Mexico?
Well, there's a political dimension. And I have no inside knowledge whatsoever on Governor Newsom's ambitions. I don't. I mean, you can read headlines and go to the online media and the print media, and there's always going to be some comments that he has ambitions to be president. But the interesting thing to me about California is that it is a microcosm of what's going on in Democratic Party-controlled states. You have a governor who's liberal. You have a lieutenant governor and attorney general who are also liberal Democrats. But they're exercising an authority that other liberals are opposed to. And again, it goes into this idea of community safety versus the rights of the homeless. And there are going to be accusations that fly about this is being done for, to show tough on crime and the like. The homeless are least likely to be able to stand up for themselves. But I really think there's another thing going on in California. And having traveled last year to the Bay Area, when San Francisco and Oakland have changed quite a bit over time with the increase in homeless population, there's been one characterization on Bloomberg was that the homeless population had gotten quite aggressive in San Francisco. The city is hemorrhaging money and it's hemorrhaging people, and that's true across the Bay Area, which is the most expensive place to live in. And the governor, I think, is trying to pursue a policy that makes the Bay Area livable and, again, for working families. That's true in Los Angeles as well. And it does seem to be heavy-handed, but governors have economic records that they have to run for office on, whether it's, rerunning for a second term or for higher office. And I think Newsom is in that category. He has not yet exceeded the parameters of the Supreme Court's decision, because the Supreme Court's decision was basically a green light to the states to go ahead and do something. And there are other parts of the Bill of Rights that could contain that action, but they can criminalize, they can move homeless encampments and the like.
So I want to talk about some of what we have heard from a couple of New Mexico cities that have increasingly confronted issues around homelessness over the last several years. So we'll start here with Albuquerque. One of the things that came from a city press release in reaction to the Supreme Court decision It was a news release from the mayor's office. It contained this quote, which was not attributed directly to anybody besides the mayor's office and the spokeswoman there. The quote was, quote, "The city appreciates more flexibility to enforce ordinances and will continue to protect the rights of unhoused individuals." Mayor Keller was attributed with this direct quote. He said, "I know there will be mixed reactions to this ruling in our community, so I want to be clear. The city will continue to do everything in our power to get people the help they need and to deal promptly with illegal encampments." The city says it responds to more than 50 illegal camps a day in that same release, and they say they'll continue to respond to those camps. What is your take, Professor, on what the city of Albuquerque is saying here about this rule?
Well, it's sort of a mixed message, isn't it? On the one hand, there are legal temporary encampments. There are homeless shelters, but there are not enough homeless shelters and bed spaces for individuals. I think what the city is essentially saying is they're going to focus on drug treatment, but of course there's a voluntary aspect to drug treatment. They're going to focus on creating spaces for homeless encampments, but then narrowly, regulating where those encampments are. They're going to listen to communities. I think that's a positive part of the message about if you're going to have one down here, why isn't there one in the Heights? That sort of thing. I don't think that we will anywhere in New Mexico, particularly Albuquerque or Santa Fe, do what some draconian measures have been done in other states, like in Florida. We won't make it illegal to feed the homeless. That has other aspects to it, like religious freedoms and the like that are encroached on. But the one thing that's not in that message is a solution.
Yeah. That's been a complicated solution to get to, it seems like. And notably, the city of Albuquerque did not say one way or the other if it agreed with the ruling. And meanwhile, it's a very different story in Santa Fe. Following the Supreme Court decision, the city of Santa Fe put out its own news release saying, quote, and this is attributed to Mayor Alan Weber there, Mayor Alan Weber, city firmly against homelessness ruling. So that release went on to say, quote, this decision not only fails to address the root cause of homelessness, but also perpetuates a cycle of instability and marginalization for some of our most vulnerable citizens.
And we know, though, meanwhile, the city has certainly dealt with issues surrounding homelessness. Back in June, I remember our KRQE reporter, Bella Olaga, she went there to Santa Fe for what ended up being a business meeting organized by the Chamber of Commerce up there. She reported in there how the discussion quickly shifted from a talk about retail crime to a lot of businesses, complaining, airing their frustrations with problems surrounding homelessness. So, Professor, wanted to ask you, what do you think is driving that reaction in Santa Fe, this all-out kind of firm stance against the SCOTUS ruling, despite the mayor there also being confronted with the issue, too?
The city of Santa Fe has some similarities to San Francisco on the one hand, and the cost of living is somewhat higher than it is here in Albuquerque. On the other hand, they don't have the homeless numbers that we have in Albuquerque. Yeah. And so, a cynical person might say, well, it's easy to take that stance when you're not confronted with it. Now, they do have a homeless population in Santa Fe. I'm not minimizing that.
Yeah, it's certainly for smaller.
But it's smaller, and it's easier to take care of individuals when it's smaller. When it's fewer of them, right. Now, but you touch on an important thing. The one thing that the U.S. Supreme Court cannot do and hasn't tried to do, and the one thing that the city of Albuquerque can't do, and that is address businesses and the economics of homelessness. And, you don't have to live in Nob Hill, like that area like I do, to understand that if you go across to Central Avenue and you head eastbound, how many stores have closed, right, or closed downtown? And one of the reasons they've closed is because of homelessness issues in parking lots and the doorways where consumers aren't going in. And the other reason they've closed is because of a shoplifting issue. It's the retail theft. And while not all homeless and not all retail theft are interrelated, there's enough of a relationship there so that small businesses, but also in multinational businesses, drugstore chains, big box stores, have decided that the loss isn't worth keeping the store open.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we still have that closed down Walmart on San Mateo. Catty corner to that, there used to be a CVS that's closed down.
Right.
There's a lot of businesses shuttering, and it's unfortunate, but it is a tough problem to solve, it seems. And moving forward, it seems like the effect of this Supreme Court ruling is really going to be entrenched with the question of who is in power locally and their view on homelessness or issues surrounding it. What are your thoughts about that? Kind of really sending it back down to the local level.
So there are other rights within the Bill of Rights. I don't think we're at a point, or even close to a point, where homeless people will be rounded up and placed into prisons and isolated encampments, the American gulag type situation. We're not that. But I think that back to work programs that are tied into benefits are one area that we'll likely see an attempt at. I think that public safety ordinances are going to become much more the norm and much more vigorously enforced. For example, no panhandling at on-ramps or off-ramps, no panhandling or sleeping or having sleeping items within a certain area of schools. Things like that we're going to see, and then we'll see them more vigorously enforced. I think we'll also see greater, not lobbying efforts, but greater power to the voices of communities that haven't had that power in the past. The less wealthy communities in our cities being able to say, you cannot have a housing encampment here. And because they have representation at City Hall too, and in the council. So we'll see that. At the end of the day, where do the homeless people go? The court hasn't answered that. The city council hasn't answered that. I can't predict that.
We'll be right back with more of the New Mexico News Podcast.
Hi, I'm Ann Perrette, an investigative reporter in our KRQE Investigates unit. We are always working on something new. Right after it airs on KRQE, you can always find it on our website, krqe.com, or the next day on our KRQE YouTube channel.
As a kind of history note, we have seen so many of those public safety ordinances challenged in the courts up until this ruling. So it will be interesting to see if those do make their way back. Kind of
right. Well, I don't think we'll see as many challenged in the federal courts because the Supreme Court issued a very broad ruling. I think they'll be dismissed. Now, under our state constitution, they'll still be challenged in the state courts. That's a quicker process.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. I know in the last podcast, you two talked about the bigger picture, about how this ruling could mean something more, that the idea that this might not just affect those who are impacted by homelessness. With this ruling, is there something beyond homelessness that we could see affected or impacted by this ruling, do you think?
This ruling was directed at homelessness. However, Justice Thomas and others believe that a case I earlier mentioned, a decision I earlier mentioned, the California versus Robinson case on status crimes, was wrongly decided by the Warren Court in 1964. And I think there'll be a move to have that particular decision overturned. And that decision, if it were overturned, it would allow cities to not just make it illegal to be drunk in public, but to do things like force known alcoholics or force known drug addicts to register and to only be permitted in certain areas. It would almost, in the most draconian way, if that decision were overturned, as some conservatives want it to be, could place people who haven't really committed any crimes, but are addicts, in the same category of sexual offenders who have to register but can't live within areas of the schools. And I think that society and judges and lawyers need to think that through, because there may be very real, important reasons for not allowing sex offenders to live near elementary schools and high schools and allowing the community to know who's in their neighborhood. There's recidivism rates through the roof in that category of criminals, and that is a public danger. But to do something similar to that to people who have had a lifetime of drug addiction or alcohol addiction does seem to run afoul of the basic freedoms that most of us embrace, that we have, and define us as human beings, of people of kindness and, community citizens and the like. But this case could be a stepping stone towards that scenario that I just mentioned if Justice Thomas and others had their way.
And you can read more about the Robinson decision. They mention it in this Supreme Court decision.
Yes.
And also, if you listen back to our last podcast, we do discuss that case more at length, I will say. But yeah, it will be, it was something that happened over the summer, but I certainly think it will be a slow rollout depending on how each municipality and how each state handles homelessness. But like you said, even with this ruling, the path is still not clear on how to solve homelessness.
No, it doesn't solve anything. It just gives, it does what I said, it kicks it back into the political arena. It's the voters, it's city councils, it's state legislatures, but that doesn't mean there's a solution, right? So.
Yeah. Well, it is fascinating to talk about, and I guess time will tell, as they say, when how these things make their way into ordinance and laws, and really what political power does with that. So, Professor Kastenberg, thank you so much for joining us here for this conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks again to UNM School of Law professor Joshua Kastenberg, who for the first time joined us actually in person in the studio. We've always talked to him on Zoom, but it was nice to have that conversation with him in the new digital studio. We hope you're enjoying the video version of this podcast.
Absolutely. We appreciate y'all watching here. You can catch us on YouTube. You can also catch us on krqe.com with these video versions, and then audio versions, of course, are in all the places where you normally listen. If you have an idea, let us know at chris.mckee@krqe.com. That's my email. You can also reach me at Chris McKee TV on social.
And I'm Gabrielle.Burkhart@krqe.com via email and gburknm on social media. Thank you all for listening.